Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a conversation with Noam Chomsky. We apologize for the delay. As some of you will know, there were issues with our registration system. We wanted to make sure that we got everybody in that we could, so thank you for bearing with us on that one. Professor Chomsky is a native Philadelphian. He studied at the University of Pennsylvania, receiving his doctorate in 1955, and in that same year, he accepted a teaching position at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's been at MIT ever since. In 1966, he was appointed the Ferrari Hard Professor of Modern Languages and Linguistics. In 1976, the Institute Professor, and now he is Professor Emeritus of Linguistics, although still active as a teacher and scholar. He is a linguist, philosopher, a cognitive scientist, and also, this is what brings us here for this particular part of the day, a political activist. Author of more than 150 books, arguably the best known living academic, and I'm told the most cited of all living authors. So there we are. It's, of course, his role as a political activist, a self-declared libertarian socialist, that leads to this particular event. And he comes by that title very honestly. In 1967, with his essay entitled The Responsibility of Intellectuals, it was published as a supplement to the New York Review of Books, he emerged as a leading academic critic of American domestic and foreign policy, and most specifically the war in Vietnam. In fact, I was just saying to him earlier that I first heard his name in this very room in 1968 as an undergraduate student when we were having conversations at Carleton about the war in Vietnam, shall we say. This was followed in 1969 with a book of essays, American Power and the New Mandarins, and there were many more to follow. Professor Chomsky has been outspoken in his criticism of many aspects of modern society, including institutions, the media, perhaps especially corporate capitalism, the military, and not only in his own country. So, not one to eschew controversy, he has called Canada's Human Rights Commission, quote, outrageous, unquote, and the legislation which created it, hypocrisy, quote unquote. In the process, earning accolades from figures, well, a name that some of you may know, Ezra Levant. In an interview with CBC, he called our former Prime Minister, Lester Pearson, I hope I'm not misquoting him, a war criminal. And more recently, he's been critical of a lack of adequate security on the Canada-US border, complaining that the American government was much too lax when it came to its northern border. So, always provocative, always interesting. I give you Noam Chomsky and Rebecca Shaw.
We're all really honored to have you here. And how this is going to work is we'll talk for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have another 45 minutes or so for audience questions. I just want to remind people to turn their cell phones off if you haven't already. So the title of this discussion was Democracy in the Public University. And I thought I'd just start by a really big question, which is, what do we mean when we talk about a public university? What is it that makes a public university public?
Well, there's a technical definition. Public, it depends on who is in charge of the administration, the finances, and so on. It's either the government or it's a private institution. If it's the government, it's a public university. If it's a private institution, it's a private university. Actually, that's just technical. The boundaries are extremely flexible. As I say, take my own university, MIT. technically it's a private university, but overwhelmingly subsidized by the government. In fact, when I got there in 1955, it was, and up through the early 70s, in fact, it was probably 90% of the academic program was paid by the Pentagon. Not just public, but Pentagon funded. The political science department was openly funded by the CIA up until the early 60s, when it got kind of embarrassing. After that, some other technique, but since then the funding has shifted, but for interesting reasons having to do with the nature of the economy. But like I say, technically it's private, but from another point of view, it's public. The administration is private. The trustees are not specifically responsible to state authorities. On the other hand, if you go down the street to the University of Massachusetts, that's entirely public. Also gets some funding from the federal government and so on. Harvard is right near us, has a huge, biggest private endowment in the world. It's a private university, but again, there's plenty of government funded work going on.
And I think when a lot of people talk about defending the public university, which we tend to do here, we're not, I think most of us are not imagining a time of Pentagon funding or its equivalent. So I'm wondering if you could talk more about a specific relationship between democracy and public universities, sort of not just in the technical sense of that you're describing.
Well, actually, the details are revealing. So while MIT was completely Pentagon funded, like in 1968, I was in a lab that was 100% funded by the three armed services. But that lab was also the center of anti-war resistance in the country. I mean resistance, not protest. So several of us, including me, were on the verge of long jail sentences. That was all under Pentagon funding. And there was no interference. I mean, I, for years, 25 years, was teaching undergraduate courses in social and political issues, social change. They were open to the community, usually met in the evening. I was doing it on my own time, but the university didn't shut them down. They could get a room and so on. A lot of the students who came out, in fact, were involved in the activism in the 60s. A lot of them were doing, some of the former students are doing things right now. So, yeah, it was Pentagon funded, but it was completely free. Interestingly, as it got more corporate funded through the later period, it introduced more secrecy. There was no secrecy on the campus. There was no war work. I was actually under student pressure. One of the reasons I know the data is that in 1969, under a lot of student pressure, there was a period of great student activism. There was protest about military labs, which were administered by MIT. And it was reaching a kind of a crisis which nobody wanted, so everybody did what you do when there's a crisis, you establish a commission. And the commission looked into it, and I was on the commission, and so I was one of the people, student faculty committee, which looked into student financing and what goes on campus and so on. It turned out, it's published if you want to look at it, Powell's Commission, but I may have the data not exactly right. This is 45 years ago, but roughly it was like this. About half the institute budget was administering the military labs. Now, the military labs actually did classified secret military work. But that was kind of a joke, too. Like my wife worked in one of the military labs. I mean, it was totally open. Everybody people went up and back to seminars. Technically, it was secret. The academic side was open, but again, this was a kind of a porous distinction. So about half was military labs. The other half was the academic budget. Of the academic budget, I think in '69, maybe 90% was Pentagon funded. No war work except for the political science department. The political science department was involved in pacification secret seminars and things like that, which you're not supposed to have. But outside the political science department, there was no war with, except in the sense that anything that anybody does could have some military application. Through the 1970s and up to the present, the Pentagon, there isn't a more recent study, so I'm kind of estimating details later, but roughly what happened is that Pentagon funding declined. Funding from the National Institute of Health and the other government health-related institutes increased, and there's more corporate funding. Now the shift from the Pentagon to the National Institute of Health and so on, now that has to do with something that's not too well understood, except by the business world. I mean, they understand it, but I don't think economists understand it, at least the ones I talk to. I mean, the Pentagon was not funding war work. They were funding the high-tech economy. They were just helping. The Pentagon was a technique for deluding taxpayers into providing funds for the future benefit of private corporations. So a lot of the work that was going on, for example, was developing computers, the internet, in fact, the whole IT revolution, lasers, just about the whole high-tech economy. We don't live in a capitalist society, nothing remotely like it. There's the innovation, the initiative, the funding, and so on comes in many ways through the state sector. And for business, that's great. You know, they wait around, they finally get the profit. So, great. And the taxpayer pays for it on the assumption that, you know, we're saving ourselves from the Russians or something like that. That's basically the system. Well, from the 50s and the 60s, the cutting edge of the economy was electronics based, and the Pentagon's a kind of a good cover for that. It's shifted. Now the cutting edge of the economy is more biology based, so you're shifting to other government institutes like the NIH, National Institute of Health. But that largely has to do with where the economy is going. Like in the 1950s and 60s, around MIT and similarly other research universities, this is all over the country. MIT's extreme, but all over Stanford, North Carolina, and so on. Around the research universities, you get small startups. Those are faculty members who are using the government-funded research and development to set up small businesses. And back then they were electronics based. And if they were successful, they'd be bought up by, you know, Raytheon, high-tech, the big high-tech companies. Now if you go around the campus, the startups are genetic engineering, biotechnology, pharmaceuticals, and the big buildings around are Novartis and all these guys who want to milk the research and development that's going on under government auspices in the university. And that's the basis for a lot of the economy. Actually, this goes way back, but it really took off after the Second World War dramatically. I mean, there was plenty before, but nothing like this. And partly because of just changes in the nature of science and technology. Like in the 1950s, say when I got there, MIT was actually an engineering school. Like you went there if you wanted to build things. You know, if you want to build a bridge or make an electric circuit or whatever it may be. And now if you want to do that stuff, you go to Wentworth Institute or some other place. MIT is a science university. You study basic science and basic math. And you take pretty much the same courses, whether you're in aeronautical engineering or electrical engineering or whatever. It's kind of adapted, but not much. And the reason is the science has just changed. This was a period in which really for the first time, the advances in science could significantly affect the technological development. And the technology changes fast because more is learned. So if a student learns the technology today, then they won't be able to get a job 20 years from now. Technology will be different. If they learn fundamental science, they can grow with it. So everything changed. The same is true with the biological drive research towards short-term applied work. I mean, when the Pentagon or the NIH is funding something, they're thinking about the long-term health of the economy. When Merck or someone is funding something, they want something for themselves, not their competitors, and they want it tomorrow. Okay. So you end up getting more short-term applied research, and you also get secrecy for the first time. There was no secrecy under the Pentagon. In fact, they wanted it to be as open as possible, because it just impedes communication among scientists and engineers. In fact, there was no security in the buildings. You could walk in 24 hours a day, with no one putting cards in front of things and all that kind of business. When it gets more corporatized, a corporation can't force secrecy, but they can make it clear you're not going to get your contract renewed if something gets out. And there have been real scandals. In fact, some of them made it to the front pages of the Wall Street Journal. The scandals were secrecy at MIT and the university. So there's a kind of a cheapening, coarsening effect, which you'd expect when a business model is imposed. That shows up in lots of ways. But to get back to your question, you just can't draw mechanical conclusions from the source of the funding. A lot of people think, a lot of my friends on the left think that if you're Pentagon funded, you must be working for the military. It's exactly the opposite. When you were Pentagon funded, they didn't care what you did. If you wanted to overthrow the government on your spare time, that's fine. As I say, it was the center of anti-war resistance. There was no interference. A little harassment of the courses from the FBI, but not from the Pentagon.
So if we were to, sort of starting from the hypothesis that that universities are in some way, or can function as engines of democracy, how does the idea of publicness figure in there, given what you just
Well, MIT is a private university, which means you have to pay tuition to get in. The tuition it's not Harvard, it's not exorbitant, but it's tuition. A public university is supposed to be free. It's supposed to be for the public. Too, because that used to be the case. In fact, even the private universities were, like you mentioned, I went to Penn. Penn is an Ivy League college, and when I went, it was $100. And you could easily get a scholarship, which I did. Working students could get a scholarship. Well, now I don't know, it's probably $20,000, $30,000. What it is. And the public universities have changed radically since the 1970s. I don't know here, talking about the United States. So by now, let me give you a personal example. A couple of months ago, I happened to be giving talks in Mexico City, at the National University. A big university. It's a couple 100,000 students, pretty high quality, good facilities, students, smart students, good faculty. They're low salaries by our standards, but quite an efficient, quite a good university, perfectly respectable university. It's free. 10 years ago, the government tried to slightly raise tuition. There was a national student strike, and the government backed off. In fact, one of the main administration buildings on campus, I discovered, is still occupied by students from that strike. Community Activities Center. The administration doesn't like it. A lot of the students don't like it, but they're not calling in the police to throw them out. In the city, Mexico City, there's a public university which is not only free but open admissions. So they have compensatory courses because a lot of the students don't have the right background. I was there too. Met people, talked to students, faculty. It's pretty impressive. I happened to go from there. Mexico is, of course, a poor country. I went from there to California, which is maybe the richest place in the world outside of Qatar or some artificial place. In California, they are consciously destroying the best public education system in the world. I mean, the California public education system was pretty amazing. The universities were great universities. true in many states in the United States? No. Well, these are all steps towards privatizing society and creating a kind of a two-tiered society, which is geared for the wealthy and the privileged, and the rest of you can, survive somehow if you can. Those are big processes, not just universities. None of this is economically driven. You can see that by comparing Mexico to the United States. Mexico is a poor country. The United States is the very richest country in history. So it's not economic. In fact, a couple of economists have looked into the actual economics of it. Public education in the United States, it's totally free, runs about less than 2% of gross domestic product. Approximately, I think the figure was about 4 months worth of administrative waste in the dysfunctional healthcare system. There's a privatized healthcare system, which is a total disaster, naturally. Twice the per capita costs of anywhere else. Rather poor outcomes, a lot of administrative costs. And I think the figure was about 4 months of administrative waste or something like that could fund the public education system. I mean, a fraction of the incomes of the 10,000 richest people in the country. It's not an economic problem. These are social decisions, both in Mexico and in the United States. So what's a public university supposed to mean? Well, like Mexico. It should be free. It should be open. There should be an option for open admissions. And resources should go into it to make sure it works. It's not impossible.
Do you think that the kinds of rising tuition fees, increasing reliance on student fees for operating budgets, endowments, all these things, do you think that these are just sort of, to what extent are they part of a sort of general divestment from the public sphere, from public institutions?
Partly that, but I think it's partly oriented toward the universities. This hasn't really been studied, so I'm just telling you what I think, but you can look into it. If you go back, all of this stuff began in the 70s. A lot of changes in the economy in the 70s, but one crucial thing changed with regard to the universities. The 60s, the late 60s, not the whole 60s, but the late 60s were a period of a lot of activism, and it terrified the business world, and it also terrified liberal intellectuals across the spectrum. They were terrified. Students are out of control. There's too much democracy. What are we going to do? There's some very interesting reactions, which you can read. The two main ones at opposite ends of the spectrum. And they're worth looking up. You can find them on one of them's a book, but the other you can find on the internet. Lewis Powell, who was a corporate lawyer and soon became a justice of the Supreme Court, he wrote a memorandum. It's called, you can find it, just look up Powell method. It was written to the Chamber of Commerce, to their education committee. The Chamber of Commerce is made in business lobby. And that's the picture at the right end of the spectrum. I'll get the other one in a minute. The content of his memorandum was essentially that he was totally paranoid, but he reflected the paranoia of the business world. The business world is basically totalitarian. They're used to running everything, and if anything gets out of control, the world is falling apart. And that's a typical aspect of the totalitarian mentality, and it shows up in foreign policy and all over the place. So his picture was, and it was pretty standard, that the whole university system, and in fact the media and television and everything, even the government, has been taken over by raging Marxist lunatics. All of this is so surreal. If you know anything about the facts, you'd laugh if you didn't understand that this is a natural effect, this is a natural perception of the totalitarian mentality. You can't allow anything to get out of control. And it's true, things were partially out of control. So Herbert Marcuse was teaching some students at Harvard, and Ralph Nader was popular. But for them, that meant the whole world's falling apart. So we got to do something to what he called restore the balance. So do something to make sure that in the universities the business world is the trustees of the universities. We're the ones that make the decisions. And we provide the tax funds. And we own the media. We ought to mobilize instead of letting Herbert Marcuse and Ralph Nader steal the whole world away from us. We ought to mobilize and use our power to, as he says, restore the balance. And he's very strong on not attacking academic freedom. He says that's a sacred doctrine. We have to maintain it. And we are supporting academic freedom by restoring the balance. So, we'll move from 90% control to 98% control. The balance will be restored. But that's kind of the picture. Right, that's the right end of it. And that was followed. Those suggestions were followed by the business world in all kinds of ways. And I think one of them is raising tuitions. I can't prove it, but it's at that time that raising of tuitions begins. And that's a disciplinary technique. If the kids in the 1960s could assume, I'm sure you remember this, I can take off for 2 years and become a political activist and work for women's rights or civil rights or something, and then I'll come back and pick up my career. Well, that's dangerous. It frees people to think, and that's a terrible idea. So what you want to do is trap them. So that maybe some young guy thinks he wants to be a public interest lawyer. Or you make sure that he comes out of law school with $100,000 in debt. He's going to go into a corporate law firm because he just has no choice. And once he's in there, he'll internalize the culture. It's okay, he'll be safe. And the same across the board. So it's a kind of a disciplinary technique. Well, and a lot of other things too. The business models for the universities and so on. Well, let's go to the other end of the spectrum, which is in a way even more interesting. There's a book you can read about it. It's called The Crisis of Democracy. It's a very important book. It's in 1974. It's the first publication of the Trilateral Commission. Trilateral Commission is liberal internationalists in the three major state capitalist societies, North America, Western Europe, and Japan. To get the tenor of it, that's what the Carter administration was drawn from entirely. That's what they are, basically, in the three major areas. Well, what's the crisis of democracy? You really have to read it to see. Crisis of democracy is there's too much democracy. Usually, what they said is segments of the population that are usually passive and apathetic and obedient are entering the public arena and pressing their demands. Like women and youth and elderly and workers and farmers and the population, in other words. What they call the special interest. The population is called the special interest. And there's one group that's not, and that's too much pressure on the state. They can't deal with all the special interests. There's one group that isn't mentioned, the corporate sector. And that's correct, because they're the national interest. So they have to be in control. You can't challenge them. But there's pressure from the special interests. And you have to somehow beat them back and establish what they call more moderation and democracy, keep them down. With regard to the schools, it was quite interesting. They said that, these are their words, they said the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young are not doing their job. Okay, schools, universities, churches, they're not indoctrinating the young properly. This is the liberals I'm talking about. And we got to do something to make sure they indoctrinate the young properly. And then come various suggestions. They even wanted to control the media, maybe state control of the media because they're too adversarial and free. This is the liberals. That's the other end of the spectrum. Well, the two ends of the spectrum are almost identical. And that tells you something. And out of this comes a lot of, to get back to, I don't know if anyone has studied it, and I can't prove it, but my strong suspicion is that the attacks on public universities, including things like tuition, quite possibly come out of this whole sort of mentality. It was related to things happening in the economy. I mean, that's the period when the post-war economy was sort of dismantled. The productive economy was but this was one of them, to try to reimpose discipline so we don't have problems from these students who aren't indoctrinated properly. And that conception is quite real. It's a terrific topic to study. It's a shame nobody studies it. I think you'd learn a lot if anyone did. But I think that there was a confluence of all of these things. And it's led to the period of increasing repression, which you're living under in the schools and everywhere else. I mean, you have to remember, since all of this in the economy, it's dramatic in the United States, it's almost the same in Canada, I think. And all of this set in motion a kind of a vicious cycle in which there was an increasing concentration of wealth. I mean, everyone knows that the United States is highly unequal, but most people don't know the cause of that inequality. It's in the top fraction of 1% of the population. The segment of the population is so small, it's not even picked up in the census. You have to do kind of sophisticated analysis of income and wealth to even pick them up. But it turns out the top 1/10 of 1% of the population has just gotten spectacularly wealthy. That's CEOs, hedge fund managers, the people who are playing financial manipulations and things like that. Enormous wealth. Well, maybe they don't like to believe it in political science courses, but good political scientists know, and all of you know, I'm sure, that wealth entails control of the political system. So as concentration of economic power increases, political power is concentrated the same way, and it is used to increase the concentration of wealth. So over these years, if you look at fiscal policy, rules of corporate governance, deregulation, these are all government legislation designed to increase the concentration of wealth. So you get a vicious cycle. Now, in a capitalist system, this would be self-regulating, because during the 50s and 60s, when New Deal regulation was around, there weren't any financial crises. Starting in the 70s and the 80s, with deregulation, this constant financial crisis. Right, in a capitalist system, every time, if you have a financial crisis, Citigroup tanks, okay, they go out of business. Their investors take a haircut, it's it. But that's not what happens in our system. In our system, what happens is that the bankers and the investors and so on, they go running to the nanny state that they nurture, clutching their copies of Hayek and Ayn Rand. The nanny state makes sure that the taxpayer bails them out. So it's capitalism for the poor, but not for the rich. That's an old story. It's kind of been dramatic in the last 30 years. So there's nothing self-regulating about it. But we're seeing it right now. When Obama came into office in the middle of an economic crisis, the first thing he had to do was pick an economics team, of course. Who do you pick? The guys who created the crisis. Take a look down the list. It was even commented in the business journals were full, literally. He picked the guys who created the crisis. He excluded all of their critics, including very prestigious economists, Nobel laureates and others, all out. So of course they designed programs which benefited the guys who created the crisis. So the taxpayers, the citizens have lost immensely. $8 trillion worth of home assets down to 2. But Goldman Sachs, one of the worst culprits, just announced, I think, $17.5 billion of compensation for the guys in 1/10 of 1%. Big increase for their the CEO, who picks his board that sets his salary, so it works very nicely. These are all things happening in the whole society. Meanwhile, for the last 30 years, the majority of the population, real incomes have pretty much stagnated. People are getting by much heavier workload. There's a high level of insecurity, debt's going up, and responsible for the crisis would be bailed out, contrary to capitalist principles. But there would be some compensation for the victims. So there would be efforts to stop foreclosures of homes, to provide aid so people could stay in their homes, and a lot of things like that. Well, he says half the bargain was implemented. Guess which half? The half of the people who have voices in the political system. The rest, nothing was implemented. In fact, it's getting worse. Okay, that's what happens in a system with very high concentration, incredibly high concentration of wealth in a very small sector of the population, and with it, political power. It's happening right in front of our eyes. It's getting worse and worse. They're setting the stage for the next crisis, and they'll get bailed out again. In fact, they have, he points out, Borofsky, in this same article, that the credit rating agencies now are counting in the fact that when a bank tanks, it'll be bailed out. They're counting that in when they give them credit. So therefore they get cheap credit, which gives them an extra advantage. That's our version of capitalism. It's, I don't know what you want to call it. It has nothing to do with capitalism. It's a system of economic and political benefits for the extreme wealthy, and the rest can survive somehow if they can. And that's what's happening in the university. So all of these things are combining. They're all happening in parallel. There is a cultural aspect, like the fear of student independence, this fear of freedom, which is pretty frightening. Freedom is a scary thing. So you want to make sure people like you are properly indoctrinated and controlled. Like you have a lot of debt, a lot of choices. You're insecure. You can't take chances. In fact, if you listen to Alan Greenspan, it used to be called St. Alan before the last collapse. He was the greatest economist in history. You read his testimony to Congress every year when he's crowing about the wonderful economy he's controlled, he's administering. He says straight out, its best feature is what he calls growing worker insecurity. That's the best feature of the economy. And that makes sense on his assumptions. Growing worker insecurity means that working people are afraid to ask for a raise in wages, for decent working conditions, for some tenure jobs and so on. They'll just grab on anything they can. And that's great. Makes the economy more healthy by standard economic principles. And so yes, growing worker insecurity is a great thing, and it's the same with students. If they're insecure, they're not going to go out in the streets and demand things or think about things and so on. So my feeling is that all of this is tied together very closely. And it's a really major topic for inquiry and study.
So if students are disciplined by things like rising student debt and rising student fees, I think you could also argue that the people who are in charge of indoctrinating those students are also disciplined by things like casualisation of the labor force, of the academic labor force.
That's right, because you have to discipline both students and teachers. When the Trilateral Commission goes after the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young, they're saying it's the teachers, the ministers, church figures, the people in charge of this are out of control. Really not, but for them it looked like that. They're out of control, they have to be disciplined. And what's called casualisation of labor force, or cutbacks, threats of tenure and so on, that's ways of disciplining the faculty. I mean, academic freedom always had two aspects: the freedom to teach and freedom to learn. And you got to cut them both back if you want to really control people.
So I think that you said at one point that you're uneasy about the notion of a politically engaged university, but that you also think that universities have a responsibility to foster political engagement. Does that
Well,
sound
take
like
MIT. I mean, I didn't think myself that MIT ought to become involved in the anti-war movement. It's not their job. And nor did I think they ought to become involved in the war. They should be out student center, the room in the student center. 5 people showed up. Well, in about 3 days, the whole institute was closed down, literally. There were thousands of students in the student center, 24 hours a day, and doing everything that students do, you know, everything from smoking pot to having seminars. You know. It was quite exciting. There were 2 weeks of real active engagement on campus, and the institute was virtually closed. Well, out of that came a lot of things. One thing that came out of it was, in fact, the commission that I talked about. Another thing that came out of it was that the institute itself officially devoted a full day just to consideration of the uses of technology in society. This is the main technological institute in the world. The question had never come up. Literally, people just do their work. So it was March 4th, 1969. Day was set aside for discussions, and meetings, rallies, all sorts of things on the uses of technology in the society. Well, out of that came a lot of things, like the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is still around, and very active. But the whole culture of the place changed. It's never gone back to where it was. I mean, it's not as active as it was in '68, but it's just a changed place through specific, and that's the kind of thing the university ought to be open to. I mean, it's right for the university to concern itself with the uses of technology in society. I'm not saying they should decide, okay, we're going to fight with the Viet Cong or something. That's not the institute's job. But they should be open to letting these issues be discussed and debated. And it was done very constructively, very good impact, broadly over all kind of issues. Well, okay, it's still the case right now. I mean, I was just in Toronto yesterday, but one of the big issues in Toronto, you probably know, is a school of